Hey everybody, so let's pick up on the second part of our sex and gender inequality section. So we talked a little bit about sexual harassment before and sexual violence against women, but we need to dig into that because that tells us a lot about gender discrimination. It tells us a lot about institutionalized sexism. And so in the US, of the violent crimes as defined by the FBI, rape is the most frequently committed of all violent crimes, but is the least officially reported. And when we say officially reported, that means reported to law enforcement. And there's a lot of questions why that is. And there are reasons that are cultural, and there's also structural reasons for it. One of the cultural reasons is there has historically been a cultural misunderstanding around what is rape, what is sexual assault. And the historical viewpoint was always, oh, in order to be a rape victim, it has to be the stranger in the bushes, or it has to be some stranger that rapes you or sexually assaults you. And as we know now from plenty of years and years of research, is that that's not the case. The most likely victim offender relationship in terms of rape and sexual assault is a victim and offender that either know each other, are dating, or are acquaintances. And so in most cases of rape and sexual assault, the victim and offender know each other. So there's that to start off. So if there is this cultural misunderstanding and we don't even know the correct definition of rape and sexual assault, then of course that's going to lead to underreporting right away. And so that's why a lot of the training and information dissemination now is focused on, at first, just correctly teaching you, here is what rape and sexual assault, here's what they are, here is how often they occur and where they occur and things like that. So that's one reason. There's also we have a culture of victim blaming and victim blaming where you blame the victim with statements such as, like, why were you wearing that? Why were you intoxicated? Why were you in that position? And so one, of course, that is victim blaming and it's gross, but that is also going to quell reporting, because if the victim is ashamed to admit they were victimized or blames themselves and internalizes this, then they're less likely to report as well. Also, if they fear reporting and they fear that those they're reporting to and telling are going to blame them, that they're less likely to report as well. So that's also driving that. Also, the way the laws are written make it really hard to hold an offender accountable, because you have to prove that there was a lack of consent, and consent is poorly understood, often poorly defined. It varies state to state, and it's a really high bar to have to meet in terms of a legal threshold. And so that's another reason. Also, historically, law enforcement have been very poor, and they've been not well trained at handling sexual assault and rape victims. And just the process itself can be very re-victimizing. And so, like, a lot of more progressive police departments now are using the you have options model, which is trying to essentially provide the victim with all possible reporting options, but also always use a victim-friendly approach, victim-first approach, that is trying to overcome many of the barriers that have existed and still exist around the re-victimization process. However, sexual assault and rape reporting, so let's do sexual assault reporting in college campuses, it's really complex. It's really complex because in one, reporting to some individuals, it'll be handled in the school setting. If you report to law enforcement, it's going to be handled in the court setting. And then in some cases, it's handled in both. There's different thresholds in terms of, what it takes to hold an offender accountable in the court system and the education adjudication system. There's different processes around testimony and having to give statements and things of that nature. So there's that. There's also different punishments that come with, obviously, the criminal justice. The court system is going to use criminal justice punishments, whereas the school system is going to use education punishments. And so, that process is extremely confusing and complex for anyone, much less if you have just gone through the trauma of being a victim of a sexual offense. So it's extremely confusing and hard to understand these policies and reporting processes. And then on top of it, there is plenty of detailed stories of, hey, even if you get in this process, it can be really victimizing because these processes are done in ways that you have to tell your story over and over again, which can be re-victimizing. There's a lot of insinuation of victim blaming that happens in these processes. Some universities, like universities that have religious affiliations, have a history of punishing students if they were victimized but intoxicated while victimized. And so with all with all of that, that all those different factors are going to make reporting less and less likely. Also, sometimes victims fear reporting because maybe whatever form of justice exists is a different form of justice they want. For example, since most of them have a relationship, if they don't win the case, they may fear retribution from the accused offender. They also, on the other hand, maybe say, well, I want them to be punished. I want justice that looks like this, but don't want something extreme as prison time. And that kind of thinking is not uncommon. In fact, the U.S. we use this very punitive model. Plenty of countries use a restorative justice model. And a restorative justice model gives control to the victim and allows the victim to determine what is justice to them. And that's just a model that we don't have in our criminal justice system here, and exists in some education settings, but not enough. And so for that reason, sexual violence against women, that gives you some of the details of why it occurs at such a high rate, but is reported so low. And because of this reality, this further inhibits women's everyday behavior. It further inhibits women freedom to be able to go drink at a party, to be able to talk to somebody at a bar and not fear that they are a predator or a potential offender, to not fear getting in an Uber at night. And that just, you see these everyday restrictions that are placed upon women because of this reality of sexual violence that happens against them. And that's just and that creates another form of privilege. Now, men are sexually assaulted, men are raped, men are sexually harassed. That is correct. And the reason that we don't talk about it as much is because it happens at a much lower rate, but it's still important because all these cases should be treated properly and should not be done in a victim blaming way. It shouldn't be done a way that challenge the social constructions of gender either. So that tells you a little bit more about that. Now, we've mentioned before, and this is kind of where we'll to wrap things up, is into institutional sexism. So just like institutional racism, sexism happens at the personal level. However, we have various gendered and sexist policies that are built into our legal system. They're built into company policies. They're built into customs. And this happens in a lot of different ways, and it is more dangerous than personal sexism in many ways because it often happens invisibly. We just treat it as normal or the status quo, and so it's harder to identify, it's harder to interrogate and understand its ramifications. And so, and within institutional sexism, we also have institutions that tend to prefer masculine qualities. And one of the greatest examples of this is, for any of you that follow politics, we're seeing more and more women run for some of the highest political offices in the land, which is wonderful. The problem being is the evaluations of women running for office is extremely gendered, it's extremely sexist, and you need to take a step back sometimes and realize, the way we are evaluating her and judging her, we aren't doing that we aren't evaluating the man she's running against in the same way. For example, you see a lot of women that are candidates, they struggle with, do I wear a suit to look more masculine, or do I wear a dress to conform to feminine gender norms? How's that going to be evaluated? Women that are strong leaders often, creates angst among viewers because they either are intimidating by that woman's strength and her knowledge and her competence. And also, this just shows a general resistance that men, especially having a patriarchy, when women begin to break down these barriers and begin to move into these powerful roles. For example, you'll see, women that are running for office have to battle with, acting, conforming to feminine but at the same point, not pulling off, potential voters that are men who may be intimidated by her knowledge, her breadth of knowledge, her competency. And you see that a lot. And, always for you all being, good scholars, I want you to think through, we see a lot where somebody like me, a white man, I can teach you something. I can teach you about gender and privilege and racism and things of that nature. And I often don't get much pushback. I get an easier level of buy-in being a white man. Women that work in academia don't get that automatic buy-in. In fact, even evaluations of your professors that are women, they tend to be very sexist, and they have a sexist gendered lens to them, and you can really read, it shows up in these evaluations, and there's good research to show that how women are evaluated harsher than men are, and they're evaluated on characteristics that nobody would ever dream of evaluating a man on. And that's really important that we begin to interrogate those, because those things have just become institutionalized, and we need to interrogate them and tear them down. Now, within institutions, now not just in politics, gender inequality and discrimination happens, in all social institutions. But education, we'll kind of think about education, because this is where we were all in the education system, and we can think about the ramifications of it, and we'll conclude here. Now, all throughout elementary and middle school, we consistently find that on average, girls outperform boys on standardized tests. However, boys still tend to have higher expectations of themselves, higher self-esteem. This can be because they're seeing more examples of men in leadership positions in their history textbooks or on their TVs. They're being told that they can be anything that they want. They see themselves in all positions of power, and so that can create higher expectations, despite not doing as well often than the girls in their class on standardized measures. Also, there is a lot of things that girls have to face in the school system that boys don't have to face. For example, when it comes to whether it be educator sexual abuse or fellow sexual harassment by students, girls have to deal with a lot more unwanted sexual attention than boys do, which can make this school environment extremely stressful. Girls have to read textbooks that have fewer mentions of the contributions of women, so harder to see themselves in these big positions of power. And there's also a lot of dress codes, and this is a classic example, of where you can see discrimination written in policies and laws. There's a lot of dress codes that are essentially forcing girls to dress a certain way so they don't distract boys. Now, of course, the way to properly address that is you teach boys, hey, don't objectify girls, don't objectify them, treat them as human beings, not as objects, don't commodify them, and this won't be a problem. However, what we tend to do is the other way, is we say, no, girls, you need to conform to these dress codes so you don't tempt your classmates that are boys. And those dress codes are just an example of discrimination. But when you read that, when you read these policies and dress codes, they are going to be, just like we had colorblind laws, these are going to be gender blind. And they're not going to say, hey, you have to do this because you're distracting to boys. But that's clearly the intention, and that's going to have the disproportionate impact on girls in that setting. Now, when looking at college women on average tend to have higher GPAs and study more than their counterparts, than college men do. However, men are more likely to major in disciplines that have higher career pay, like STEM disciplines, business disciplines. And you often wonder why that is. And that's often because there is steering that happens early on, even in college, because the general assumption is, this boy or this college man, he's going to be successful, he's competent, and steering them into those disciplines where there's a lot of hurdles for girls and women to get into the STEM fields, to get into business fields. And in fact, you're seeing a lot of the effort now trying to break down those barriers, trying to increase STEM opportunities for women and girls, trying to increase business opportunities for women and girls. Now, every major is, obviously, I think every major is still important. However, when we look at things like the wage gap is going to be driven a lot by, you're going to see on average, men make more than women do, even when holding the same positions. And often that gets, accounted. You'll hear the explanation, it's because, men are going into self-selecting into fields that have higher earnings. However, that masks all the different things that influence the man to go into the higher earning field, and the woman who was just as competent and just as knowledgeable, if not more so, going into a field that had less career earnings. And so it masked the structural barriers that were there along the way. It masked the access to opportunities that were there for the young boy, not the young girl. And so that's where, and this plays out a lot in the education setting. It doesn't have an education, because gender discrimination happens in the healthcare system, it happens in the economic system, it happens throughout. However, you all being in education can think of the ways, especially like we do it at an early age, and we'll make this the last thought of the lecture. Think about, when you're a young boy and you exhibit leadership qualities, that is usually celebrated. They say you are a leader. That is great. You can be a leader in your sports team. You can be a leader in your classroom. Young girls often don't get that same evaluation, especially young black girls. They are seen as intimidating when they do that. You tend to hear girls saying, "Oh, you're bossy," whereas they're exhibiting the same leadership qualities as the young boy, but they're not being rewarded for that. And that kind of socialization is going to make a big, big difference long term. And that's where you can really begin to unmask some of that discrimination. Okay, I hope you all enjoyed this section and learned a lot, and have a great day and a great weekend.